All right, so now we're in Chi2 box, the slicer I use most of the time. I've also used Lychee slicer in the past. It's just kind of whatever mood I'm in. Chi2 does most of the work for me though, so I tend to use that. All right, so I'm gonna print this with Ceratec ABS green because it's cool looking, and that's really about the only specifications I have for it right now as far as fishing lures go. I'm gonna do a more detailed in-depth test of different resins and how they perform in the future, but right now, it's what we're using. All right, so now I just go get my parts here. I just click and shift click to get all three of them, drop them in here. And first thing I'll do is unselect that checkbox for select all. And just take care of my pin. I'm gonna rotate it, flatten by face, click this face. And I just print the pins flat to the build plate. Like, there's no reason to make this extra complicated. We have the fillet on there, and that's gonna kind of compensate for any elephant's foot we have. Worst case, I gotta like rub it on a piece of sandpaper like twice. It's cool. And then the other thing we're going to do here real quick is we need at least 3 of these pins, and while this is selected here, I just hit this little copy and it's going to start popping them in here. And you know, I usually just go ahead and make a few of these so I don't have to print them next time. Now you might be wasting some resin if it turns out that this is a crap design, but you know, I'm going to send it, bro. Okay, so I moved them all to the edge because one thing I've learned is you want to avoid the middle of the build plate kind of if you can. And it's not really a build plate issue, it's more of your FEP issue. It has the most flexibility right in the center there because it's the furthest away from the edges that are holding it in place. So you'll generally get better prints the further away from that middle you are. It's not that you can't get great prints in the center, it just kind of increases your chances of success. Okay, so now is where we get kind of into some specific fishing lure type deals. What you want to do, deals. I got deals. Now we get into the considerations for printing the actual lure halves. And this can really be for any 3D printed object that you're going to glue together, but I know fishing lures. So in general, you're going to want to avoid any sections, edges, faces that you're going to glue together. You're going to want to not put supports on those, right? So all of this big space in the middle, these little guys here, where I'm going to glue in my pins, I want to not put supports on any of that stuff. I also want to avoid kind of as many supports as possible. Just in general, that's going to make cleanup a lot easier. So what I like to do for these guys is I come in here, I click rotate, and I'm going to rotate them kind of like that. And that really puts the lure at kind of a, you know, I don't know what it is, 40-ish degree angle. And I also want to leave this lure straight up and down, at least in relation to this face. If I tilt it one way or the other, I'm going to have to either put some supports here on this face or on this outside face. And I really want to avoid as many supports out here on this face as I can, and especially on this face, because I want to minimize the amount of sanding. So I'll run supports kind of in a line across the back here, and maybe some supports into this section here, into these cavities, because if I get support material in there, it's going to break off. It doesn't really matter that much. You know, I'm just going to have some ball bearings and beads and stuff rattling around in there. And it doesn't really impact that performance as bad as it's going to be if I start sanding this edge and it gets out of whack and not level. And I just don't want to sand that much. And I tip it over this way just to keep them on the back. You could probably do it and tip it this way to keep them on the belly if you want. I just find it easier to sand the top of the lure here because I don't have any holes for the screw eyes or anything to mess with. If I sand this later, you know, this hole has a tendency to collect a lot of dust from the sanding, and then it becomes a mess to clean out, and it's no fun. Okay, before I jump into adding supports, I'm going to come over and rotate this one as well. Pretty much the same exact orientation, same exact-ish. And then I'll kind of move these guys out to, not the edges, but just away from the middle. All right, now this is one kind of weird thing with Chi2 is if I select everything and go into supports, it's gonna want to support all these little guys, which I don't want to. So just make sure you have your 2 objects that you need to add supports to selected. I just clicked 1, held down the shift key, clicked 2. Those are my 2 bodies, and it's gonna leave these alone. So when I go into supports, these are basically my options here. So it's raised it up 5 millimeters off of the build plate, and I use a raft just because it makes things a little bit easier to remove later. Now what you'll see here is, you know, you'll have these red areas, kind of get tricky to see with the raft there. So these are all of the all the sections of the model that Chi2 Box feels are over the angle that it's safe to print. You absolutely want to avoid anything being parallel to the build plate that spans any distance whatsoever. It's just not going to print well. So you want to basically add support to all this. Now this isn't a flat surface, it's curved, so we're not going to have kind of any deformations in there. I'll link to a video at the end that really explains the resin 3D printing process and common ways that things fail. Really, really great, and explains it way better than I'm going to explain it to you here. But the basic idea is you're going to come in here and you have this circle that's closing up. These are individual layer lines, and this layer here, where it all comes together, is basically the first layer. So you want to make sure that you have a support there, because otherwise your entire lure is going to fail, because it's just going to start printing into air. Now I'm using medium supports because you also need to consider that, especially these early supports, they have to hold this entire object up off of the build plate while it's getting printed. So they need to actually be able to sustain some weight and movements and, you know, the action of the build plate going up and down. So you don't really want to use light supports here for a solid fishing lure that's whatever it is, 110 millimeters long, right? It's too much for light supports. So I come in here and just kind of sprinkle around some medium supports. You want to stay away from the edge, because again, we want that to be as clean as possible. And I'm using medium supports to make sure that I have enough support structure to carry the weight of this lure as it goes up. And once I get the bottom kind of situated, you just want to add some stabilizing supports as we go up. And so these are going to help when you're printing, keep the lure from getting twisted side to side. And not these alone, I'm gonna have to add more, but this is kind of one half of that. And I just usually go all the way up this back section here. Again, we're gonna remove these supports. We're gonna have to sand, but if I get them all relatively lined up on one edge, then I just remove them and I kind of sand this one spine, if you will, all the way up the lure. And it makes it a lot easier to deal with. If I just ran supports kind of all over willy-nilly, then I'm gonna be sanding the whole lure down, and that's not what I wanna do. All right, that's probably good here. And I talked about, you know, 2 sets of supports to then come in and keep the thing from swaying. So, you know, you can come in here and start popping in some supports into this section. Now, when I go to remove these, you know, I'll hit them with the pliers and kind of nip them off, but it's not going to be a pretty surface in here, right? It could have holes in it or whatever, but I don't care because it's inside this cavity and it's like nothing really matters. Okay, so now we see kind of a danger spot here. You see these faces, they are pretty close to being parallel to the build plate, right? And that could cause problems. So, and that's all of these here. So I'll just kind of pop a medium. This is where you could start using actually, yeah, let's remove that, because this is where I want to start using, and I just click the remove delete support thing here, click on that support and hit delete. And then I'll click on the add support and click a light. Now this is also not a great place to put supports, because, you know, we're gonna have those pins we're gonna shove in there. And so the light support will just give support to the actual edge there, but it generally comes off cleaner than the medium support because it's obviously a smaller support. And so we'll use those here to make sure these guys print cleanly. And usually you only need one, because you can see by this line, you know, as we print up, we're gonna start here. Actually, yeah, sorry. See, I'm already upside down. We're gonna start actually on this edge here and work our way up. You can check this one in here. This one's probably okay. And then let's get this one here. Make sure we're off to a good solid start. All right, and that looks pretty good, right? So you can see here that we have more than adequate enough support to hold the weight as it's printing with all of these medium supports. And then I kind of shore up these sections that are pretty close to being parallel to the build plate. And the other thing that helps us here is the curvature on the back of our lure. You know, it kind of makes it to where it's not going to be parallel to the build plate. So what you can do here is come over here and drag this down, and it's going to kind of show you how we print going up. And what you want to watch for is just to make sure that you don't see anything that kind of hangs out in space by itself. Those are called islands. All right, so I'm looking right here in this first pinhole to see how that's coming together, and we jump that gap real quick. Now see, this layer that I just added is probably too big of a gap, because what's going to happen is then it's going to print that, and the build plate is going to go up and it's going to pull that lure away from the FEP. And if it's too thin there, it's just going to break off, right? It can't handle that. So we'll pop a support in there. And the next one seems to bridge that gap. Okay. And then we'll come up And let's keep an eye on everything else. You know, I'm not worried about this section right here because this is already fairly thick when it prints. I'm really just trying to keep an eye out to make sure we don't have single layers that are unsupported anywhere, or, you know, things floating out in space. So there's all kinds of tools you can use to check these things. What I find is, you know, auto supports generally don't work on stuff like fishing lures because, you know, we want to make sure that certain edges are very, very clean and free of any kind of bumps or stuff so we don't sand them. You know, specifically that outside edge of the lure, we want to make it that as clean as possible. All right, that looks pretty good. Now we basically come over and do the same thing. There's probably a way in Chitubox that I could, you know, do one and then mirror the other since they are exact same halves. I might not even have to export 2 halves of this lure. I just never tried it, so we're gonna do the same thing. We'll fast forward. All right, one more quick mention of these hex pin holes, right? I'm really nervous putting these supports in there because it's pretty tight fit and I don't really want anything in here. So what I would think about doing when I go to revise this is change these, the orientation of these holes perhaps to where I don't have this flat surface when I angle them at 45 degrees. Just something else to keep in mind when you're designing lures. Maybe I go with a totally different, you know, shape. Again, I don't like circles because they don't lock things in, but if you use circles, this would be a lot easier. You wouldn't have this problem. All right, there we go. Okay, now, so I hop back over here, and what I can do now is actually select these both. I still have them selected, and I can duplicate them again, make a copy of them, and it's gonna throw that in some weird places. And I print multiple just because if I'm gonna fail, I might as well fail big, and having 2 of these is not a bad idea to have around, right? Worst case, I can use them to practice my airbrushing, and God knows my airbrushing needs practice. And I'm just arranging things a little bit better. Again, trying to avoid the middle as much as possible. All right, that looks pretty good. So I'm gonna get 2 lures out of this. You know, I could probably stick another copy in the middle here. It would probably work just fine, but I think 2's enough now since we're just prototyping. Click slice and save. Writing file. Okay, our file is saved. One quick thing before we exit out of Chitubox. I'm gonna click the back button here, and I'm actually going to save this project. And I didn't do this for the longest time, and then it really kind of tripped me up because if I have a failure in this print because I don't have the right supports, or if my exposure was wrong for whatever reason, if I don't save this project, I gotta go do everything I just did all over again. So if I save the project, I just load it back up in Chitubox. Lychee has the same functionality, and I'm right here where I am right now. If I need to add more supports, I can add some more supports. If I need to remove them, I can remove 1 or 2. I don't have to re-support the entire thing. It's a good habit to get into. All right, guys, last thing we're gonna cover is printing molds. Now this is pretty straightforward as long as you're printing a mold that was designed correctly, but I'm gonna go over a few common mistakes I see people make or contact me about before we actually get into kind of the right way to print things. Okay, so I got this mold loaded in. This is a creature bait I'm working on, which you could get if you're a part of my Patreon group, links below. And what I commonly tell people is print it flat to the build plate. But a lot of people think they want to print it like this, right? But obviously if we printed it like this flat, it's gonna print super fast. So watch, we hit the slice button here. We're just gonna say yeah, because we're just messing around. This would take 1 hour, 41 minutes, and 19 seconds to print. That's pretty awesome, except it's totally gonna fail. And the reason it's gonna fail is all of these holes here are going to create tiny little vacuum spots. And this is a tremendous area to pull off of the FEP. So you have to imagine when this thing is printing, it starts at the bottom here. And as it's going up, right? I mean, look, this is layer 4 right here. You have this entire flat area trying to pull off the FEP. And most consumer printers are just not made to deal with that kind of suction force and pulling force and stickiness. Yeah, you can make it work if you set the bottom layer exposure something insanely high, you can kind of force it off. When I've done that in the past or tried to do that in the past, you get really poor print quality. You know, what happens is the FEP, like literally, you know, the FEP is flexible down here at the bottom of the resin tank, and when you pull it up, it flexes up. And if the material doesn't separate because it's pulling so much FEP up and then it goes back down and prints again, you get really kind of mushed up layers, failed layers, all kinds of bad things happen. So just don't do it this way, right? You won't save any time because you'll end up printing it like 50 times and it'll keep failing. So just don't. So the other way to print it that goes pretty fast, if I click rotate, flatten my face, and put it this way, and this has a much better success rate than obviously the previous way, which is almost doomed to fail. The things you have to look out for here is, you want to make sure that your model has these chamfer cuts on every edge. So we could go in and we could put a chamfer cut in this edge to make it easy to remove from the build plate. And the reason you want to do that is whatever face, is touching this build plate, for the first 5 layers, we're gonna get something called elephant's foot, which it overexposes the bottom layers to make sure it sticks and is properly cured to the build plate. And when you do that, there is some growth in the resin from light leak or just overexposure that's gonna make that bigger than the model, right? It's very accurate when you get printing in the other layers, but this base layer is not. So if I don't have these chamfers at the bottom, I'll end up with a lip around the edges. It'll make it more difficult to remove, number one, but the big problem is then the molds won't fit together because you'll have these 2 little lips coming off the bottom there. And then you have to sand them, and there's no sanding here, bro. Sanding is failure, especially when it comes to molds. So you still got a lot of material down here to pull off of the FEP as it's printing. You will have more success this way, but I would say you're still looking at some failures if you don't have your settings like absolutely nailed. And I just want to say something real quick about bumping up the base layer exposure to compensate for pulling more stuff off the FEP. That's rarely a good idea because you end up kind of with diminishing returns. Yes, it's stuck to the build plate, but then it's stuck so hard you can't even get it off of the build plate. And that's not good at all, right? Like when you have these things actually tuned in, it should pop off the build plate super easily, right? You shouldn't be hammering stuff. You shouldn't be putting things in the freezer. Like you shouldn't need a crowbar. Like it should just pop off relatively easily. And that's what we're going for. No one's got time to chisel that stuff. All right, so the printing time on this one is gonna be longer than the first version, but you will get more success. Let's see how long it'll take. 7 hours and 45 minutes. Now, I'll show you my settings at the end of this video for sculpt that I use on my Epax E10. And I am not optimized for speed, right? I don't really care about zoom settings or going fast. I care about sending a print in and getting success and good quality. Those are my top concerns. I don't care about ripping off 1 million prints in a day. Not my vibe. So I do print molds in this orientation occasionally, but only if I'm forced to because there's some detail in the mold cavity that prevents me from printing it the way I want to, which is the next way. I just gave it away. Spoiler alert. So the way I print molds almost all the time is this way. What you want to do is put the injection port at the top, so to speak, right? So it's the last thing printed. And generally that last face is the best face you're going to get finish-wise. And so this way, what is the downside? It takes a long time to print. Let's see how long it takes to print. 14 hours and 50 minutes. Not fun, especially if you're waiting. So if you're really on top of your game, you could print multiple of these molds at a time. You're just going to almost assuredly need to add some more resin in the middle of the print. Totally doable. What I do generally is just fire these things up and print them overnight, right? That way I feel like I'm getting stuff done while I'm sleeping, which just makes me like a super cool dude. Okay, let's briefly cover some situations where these print orientations are not going to work very well. Let's load in another mold I have. Okay, this is a 5.5 inch open pore swim bait that I'm currently testing for my Patreon members. And if you look at this, there's a couple of sections that are going to be kind of prone to failure. So if you look at this mold, and it's really not obvious, I really found this out because of the print results. But as it's going up, you have these ribs that kind of pop out. And yes, it's at an angle, but there's still some very thin pieces here of material as it's printing. And that can be prone to failing and causing problems, especially kind of right here where it kind of floats out into space. Now, I kind of say that's a little bit of a flaw in the design as well. You really shouldn't have these things floating out in space, but let's not talk about that. So one of the other problems you can have when printing vertically are these kind of big flat tail areas, right? So if I orientate this thing where the tail is at the bottom, I actually have pretty decent support structure as it's going. So I do have overhangs here and they do have quite a bit of span, but it's probably gonna be okay. I printed this way and there was a few little errors in here, but it's, you know, it worked out relatively well because you do have this whole kind of surface supporting. But if you orientate this nose down, watch what happens at the top here. As we get up here, the tail starts to print and then the other side of the tail starts to print. right there. And you'll kind of learn as you go with more experience printing. These kind of overhangs like this, yes, they're not technically islands and they're not floating in space, but the forces that are going to peel this off are almost certainly going to be too much for this little section of resin to handle, and it's going to break off. And it's going to continue breaking off kind of as it goes, right? So look, there's the first layer it goes on. That's like a hair sticking out there. So that's going to break off and not form correctly, which means that this section here is probably going to have a hard time forming correctly. So now I have all of these little chunks floating around in my print. Not good. Then maybe, you know, at some point it's going to get thick enough up here to actually start sticking. And so you're going to miss a bunch of this stuff in here most likely. So obviously that's not good for the integrity of the mold from a dimensional standpoint, right? Because now my top of this tail is going to be all whack. But also as these little bits are floating around in the resin, it's likely that they're going to end up underneath another surface and cause other print defects. So that's kind of what you want to look out for, no matter what you're printing. So in this particular mold, I actually ended up printing it this way, and it worked out really, really well. The first time I printed it this way, I was getting some peeling at the far corners of the mold, kind of in this area right here. And I just reached out to Soraya Tech and asked them if they knew of anything other than just kind of cranking the bottom exposure to heck and back to help solve that problem. And I sent them my printer config, and they replied that maybe lowering the lift speed and changing the rest after retract setting to, I had it at 1 second, changing it to 2 seconds, would probably help eliminate that problem. Again, generally speaking, the slower you go printing, the better quality print and the more success you'll have. And obviously there's a trade-off between, you know, taking 4 days to print something and getting great quality, and 1 day to print something, or 12 hours to print something and getting usable quality, right? So, but once I made those changes, everything went great, made a perfect print, and it was fantastic. And so this particular mold is very dramatic in its time differences. If I look at this orientation, my prints is 4.5 hours. And again, I could probably get at least 2 of these molds on the build plate, if not more. There's a hook slot piece that goes in there too that I don't have here, but it's real thin. And so, you know, you can get 2 molds in 4.5 hours. That's pretty awesome. So if you're printing in that vertical fashion, you know, we're getting close to the max height on my Epax E10, and the print time really shows it. 18 hours and 21 minutes. Wow, that's a long time, bro. Hey guys, hope you found that super duper helpful. I have a whole playlist of my masterclass of lure design, which is kind of up here. Kind of up here. It is up here, bro. It's right there. Which has all breakdown of how I design lures and molds and all that good stuff. So check it out. Take care. Tight lines.